Now I want to focus on what has proven to be a watershed moment for DeFi regulation, and that's what Ron touched on, and that's the Tornado Cash dynamic. The US Treasury recently issuing sanctions against Tornado Cash, marking its first action against a decentralized finance mixer. The Treasury Department imposing sanctions on Tornado Cash for helping hackers launder over $7 billion worth of currency. The agency says that the mixer service allowed cyber criminal groups, including North Korean-backed hackers, to use the platform to launder the proceeds of cyber crimes. This is a very, 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 very big development and a potentially a huge consequences for DeFi regulation. Ron, you wanted to touch on this. So firstly, why don't you explain in more detail what Tornado Cash is and why this is so consequential?
So I think let's start at the beginning. The thing about blockchain, which we like about blockchain, is that blockchain is very transparent. And if I pay you, or in fact, if you pay me, and I can see which address the money came from, I can go onto the blockchain and I can see every single transaction that you've ever made. So just think about if I'm a coffee barista and you're coming to buy a cup of coffee from me, and you pay me using your Bitcoin or your Ethereum, by virtue of the fact that you've paid me, I can see the address and I can see every single transaction that you've ever made. I can see what you've bought, what you've sold, how much money you've got in your wallet. I can see everything. And that's not practical, because if we want blockchain to be used for payments and stuff like that, it's not practical. And it's not necessarily because we want to launder money, because, sometimes you want privacy, not because you want to launder money. Sometimes you want privacy because you don't want to reveal your location. As a business, you may want privacy because you don't want your suppliers your competition to know where you're buying your goods from, or how much you're paying for your goods, or how big your orders are. And so there's some things that kind of need to be concealed. And what Tornado Cash did this very well. Tornado Cash was what they call a mixer. And the mixer, I always use this analogy of a bottle of water. If I take this bottle of water and I take two other bottles of water, and I basically take this bottle of water and I say, I'm going to pour water from this bottle in here, and I'm going to pour water from this bottle in here. I'm then going to shake the bottle. You're not going to know which water was the originator. And when you need the water, just tell me when to pour it. That's how Tornado Cash works. You put your money into it. We all put our money into it. And when you want to take money out of it, it pays it out of a centralized, or not a centralized, but a central Tornado Cash address. And so what it does is it eliminates the traceability of where the money came from, because once that happens, you don't know where the money came from. Now, you mentioned that $7 billion have been laundered through Tornado Cash. That's not true. $7 billion have been used. Tornado Cash has been used for $7 billion worth of transactions. However, Chainalysis, which is today probably one of the most reputable companies in the world, also working with the US government, did an analysis. And what they found is that only 10% of the transactions in Tornado Cash were used for hacks and illicit activity, which means that 90%, or let's say there were some other shady areas. So let's say 80% were used for perfectly normal privacy transactions that you and I have a right to make. And so what actually happened here was the US government sanctioned a protocol that is being used 80% for good or for completely legal stuff and 20% for illegal stuff. Now, there is another protocol that you and I use every single day. That protocol is called Cash. What percentage of Cash is used for illicit activities versus non-illicit activities? There is a number there. Now, what the US have done here is they've put sanctions on this piece of software, on this decentralized piece of software that doesn't have a CEO or a marketing department. It's just a piece of software. It's like the internet. It's like the US government saying, we are putting sanctions on the internet. By putting sanctions on it, what they mean is that no person may deal with this protocol in any way unless they've got the permission of OFAC to actually deal with this protocol. So what is the result? Well, the first thing is, if you use the protocol and you got money in your account coming out of the protocol, and now you want to use an exchange, the exchange has turned around and said, hold on a second, we can't deal with you because you dealt with a sanctioned party. And so what we're starting to get is we're starting to get a whole lot of protocols blocking addresses that received money from Tornado Cash. To make matters worse, what people have started to do is to take high-profile names and to send their money from Tornado Cash. Just to imagine, I sent you, Michelle, I sent you and Steve money from Tornado Cash. I sent you without you asking, without you even knowing. I sent you money from Tornado Cash. Now, all of a sudden, an exchange or a DeFi protocol looks at this and says, "Oh, hold on, I can't deal with Michelle because she dealt with Tornado Cash."
Yeah.
But you didn't even ask for the money.
So any wallet address that interacts with Tornado Cash is now at risk of violating US sanctions and all the penalties that go along with that.
Yes, very much so. And even worse, and to me, the worst part of it is that in Holland, a developer was arrested because he wrote Tornado Cash. He wrote an application that was 80% used for good and, by the way, 20% used for illicit activities. And he was arrested for writing this. I'll give another example. GitHub, which is where all the source code for projects is stored and shared and built on. Any GitHub account that contributed to Tornado Cash has been deleted. Now imagine you're a developer and you've programmed for 100 different protocols which all do good for the world, and also you also wrote some code for Tornado Cash. Your GitHub account has been deleted. Their Discord account has been deleted. Their website has been deleted because no hosting service wants to host a sanctioned entity's domain. It is absurd. I cannot believe that we're actually talking about this. That's how absurd it is. It's so absurd that it's actually unbelievable.
It's absurd, but it happened and it's real and it's going to have tremendous ramifications here. So, Steve, what are the consequences of having regulatory action against a smart contract? What does this mean for the future of DeFi?
Yeah, so Ran has hit all the hot points over here. And if you can see when I talk about Tornado Cash, I hope you can see the smoke coming out of my ears over here, because when I read this last week, I simply did not believe that this was true. So let me add some color to the very concise and articulate description that Ran did. The Office of Financial Asset Control, OFAC, who put sanctions on, has a series of lists. If you go in there onto the US Treasury website and take a look, you'll see a list called SDN, which is the specially designated nationals, and you'll see 2,000 pages of name after name after name after name. None of those people are ever visiting the Grand Canyon, and into there has been inserted a bunch of addresses. It is the first time ever that OFAC has sanctioned something that is not connected to a human being. They have sanctioned a piece of neutral code. Never been done before, unprecedented in law, and it is doubtful whether it would survive court challenge. But that's not why they did it. They are completely aware of the fact that they will probably overturn a court. It will take years. And what they've done by having this guy arrested, who may have just been a techie, probably was, we don't know for sure, probably was just a techie writing some code, is it has created a massive chilling effect on developers worldwide who develop software and now are in terror of being arrested. The problem with this whole thing is that there is a great cryptographer, one of the last great living cryptographers from the late 60s and early 70s, called David Chaum, and he defined the difference between privacy and anonymity. Blockchain transactions are not private. You can go onto any Explorer and look at them. They are partially anonymous in that they are not tied to a human being. They're just tied to a number. And very smart people are able to take those two things, which is the public transaction, the private key addresses, the date that things were sent, the location of the service that they were sent from, and draw all sorts of a conclusion. And as a consequence of that, these mixers came into life to strip out the metadata. The metadata are the send and to addresses, and David Chaum goes to a great amount of trouble to talk about how important it is to strip out metadata, to completely anonymize transactions. Why is this a good thing? Ran already pointed to that. You want to make anonymous transactions. You want to make an anonymous vote. You don't want anybody to know what vote you're making, even though you would like your vote to be public at a later stage. You want to spend cash on maybe a second bottle of scotch at the bottle store. You don't really want anybody to know about this because this is a Monday afternoon. Anonymity is built into society and civilization. And what the government has done is said, we do not want transactions to be anonymous. We want them to be visible to us. This is at the hot, molten core at the tension between individual and state. This is the issue in all of this discussion about regulation and about what a cryptocurrency is, and is it an asset, or is it a piece of foreign exchange, or is it a piece of property, or is it a collectible? At the center of this is the tension between the individual and state. And the government has gone right to the center of this thing and has basically said you may not make an anonymous payment. And as Rand said, we have made anonymous payments through the entire history of humanity by using cash. And we are told by this thing, you may no longer use cash. We want to see what you're spending money on. And the explosion that is going to happen in this thing has just started, because it is everything that the industry has been fighting about. There will be massive effects from this. Rand has already talked about this domino effect that has happened with GitHub accounts being closed and with lots of projects shutting down addresses and everybody terrified of being arrested. And the government knows that it cannot eventually win this case. I'm sure their lawyers have advised them that they will eventually lose, because a piece of neutral code is not a human being with malign intent. But what they will do is they will throw ice over a large portion of the industry, and it's a catastrophe.
I'm going to challenge you there. I agree with every single one of your points, but the problem is that somebody has to challenge the government, right? So somebody would have to now go to the government and say, hey, look, you can't do this. These are our lawyers. This is our legal team, and we're now requesting a summons. The problem is that because this is an open source piece of code, there is no person or individual that is in charge of this and that could implement a legal case. So it's almost like, for the viewers, just imagine the internet trying to sue the US government. Because that's what it is. It's a piece of code. It's a piece of software like the internet, which is not owned by anyone. And so imagine the internet would want to take the government to court for something that the internet did.
But Ron, you could have someone that's been a victim, if you will, or hurt by this regulation and hurt by being involved in the crossfire of these sanctions represent this, should that individual wanted to. As you mentioned, any wallet address that interacts with Tornado Cash is at risk of violating US sanctions. So as somebody that's had detrimental consequences due to this could, in theory, go and represent this case.
Yeah, the first lawsuit was launched today on exactly that basis on behalf of the people who have been hurt by this.
Yeah, that's very smart. But I think what they did was that they killed the protocol at a very young stage of the protocol's life. So had they done this in 10 years, when the protocol was used by some of the biggest corporations in the United States to anonymize their transactions between suppliers, and one of these big corporations, say GM or something, decided to take the government to court and say, hey, look, we've got the right to do these anonymous transactions, I think that could have happened. But the problem is that they killed this protocol at a very young stage in the protocol's life, where I don't think that there's enough firepower in that. I don't think anyone has a big enough incentive to take on the US government against deploying sanctions. That's the problem. That's the problem here. Someone said something to me which was pretty interesting. Two things. The first thing is that if the Russian oligarchs were sanctioned, and they have not yet been able to overturn the sanctions, it's going to be a long time until Tornado Cash can overturn the sanctions. The second thing came out of my show, and on my show we had Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful from Shark Tank, and Raoul Paul on my show this week, and I'm not sure which one of them said it, but they said something very interesting, and not something that I really want to support, but probably something worth saying. And they said, look, we all want regulation in crypto because regulation gives us clarity, and clarity brings money into the ecosystem. And unfortunately, in the process of regulation, we're going to have to give some and we're going to have to take some. And I think it was Mr. Wonderful, Kevin O'Leary, that said, Tornado Cash is one of the gives. It's a sacrificial lamb that we give in order to get regulation for the rest of crypto. So it's almost like you say, look, it's a negotiation with the powers that be that says, if you're willing to give up on a little bit of this anonymity, we may give you more clarity on Bitcoin and Ethereum. Now, I hate the thought of it, and I don't support that, but maybe that's how politics actually works. You have to give some to take some. I'm vehemently against what happened with Tornado Cash. I think it's a very, very, very dangerous precedent. And unfortunately, though, I think that not enough people understand it well enough to understand exactly what happened and what it means for the rest of their rights and for their future. I think, unfortunately, it's just a small bunch of crypto users at the moment. And I don't think that, unfortunately, they're going to have enough firepower or money or resources to fight the US government or OFAC and overturn this decision, unfortunately.
Taking the Tornado Cash conversation aside, central bank digital currencies, if they're implemented, then there goes your anonymity, there goes your privacy, because the government would be able to know every transaction that an individual makes, and the government would be able to potentially take away an individual's ability to transact within the system. And the bigger picture here, as far as I understand it, is to have a cashless society when it all goes digital. So wouldn't that be just a big extension of this whole anonymity and privacy concern that you've raised?
The answer to that depends on the government. That statement is true in spades when it comes to a country like China. But if one has to look at the most recent paper that was produced by the Law Society under request from the UK government, they'll see a whole bunch of rational stuff there where privacy and anonymity is, I want to say, hypothetically or supposed to be preserved in those central bank digital currencies. One would like to think that those countries who have some respect for the concept of privacy as a human right and the concept of anonymity as a human desire will include privacy guarantees within their CBDCs. The worst part of me doesn't trust that, but that is in fact what the Americans have said, that the Fed coin will respect the privacy and anonymity of transactions.
All right. So before we get into FedCoin, and I don't know how much faith I have in FedCoin honoring that, but before we get into that, what does this mean then for bigger crypto transactions and regulations if we can see how easily the government can step in and cut you out of the system? As we said, any wallet that interacts with Tornado Cash is at risk of violating US sanctions if you're just a passive recipient of now being sent something. Should that not perhaps create more of a chill over the whole sector at large, Ron?
Yeah, that's what I'm terrified of. I mean, what's to stop the government from sanctioning Bitcoin tomorrow and saying, look, if you've touched any Bitcoin address, well, then this happens. It's a very, very, very scary precedent. What happened here is, and as I say, my fear is that unfortunately, I don't think that we have the firepower to take on the oppressor here. Unfortunately, I want to touch on the point of the central bank digital currency, because the two really do hold hands. The one is, we don't want you guys to do anonymous transactions, therefore anyone who does this gets sanctioned. On the other hand, we know that most governments in the world, certainly in the first world, are looking at a central bank digital currency. Jerome Powell has gone as far as to say that they're mapping it out. In the UK, I think they're slightly further than that. There are huge dangers to me around your freedom when it comes to a CBDC. And I think that we've all just lived through a period of COVID, and we witnessed the way that governments in certain jurisdictions handled the restrictions during the lockdown. So I'll give you some examples. In South Africa, you weren't allowed to leave your house at all during the lockdowns, and you weren't allowed to have more than one person in a car, and you were only allowed to buy certain supplies from the supermarket. In the US, it was similar, but maybe slightly more relaxed. Now imagine that all being programmed into money. So it would say, hey, Michelle, you need to go and buy something really urgently. Let me give an example. You have a baby. You need to buy diapers. It's urgent. But your money is not spendable after 10 o'clock at night because there's a curfew.
Right.
Therefore, you will arrive at the shop. You will try and pay with your central bank digital currency. And the computer will say, Michelle is not allowed to spend money after 10 p.m. Therefore, this transaction does not work. And to me, the notion of giving these same people a central bank control over our money is absolutely scary. It's something that I can't resign myself to. And every time when I get that shiver down my spine, the first thing I do is I go and I buy a little bit more Bitcoin. Because one thing I know for sure, they may be able to bring in central bank digital currencies, just like they brought in COVID restrictions that none of us thought. If I would have said to you 5 years ago, the government is going to lock us at home, we're going to have to stay at home for 3 months, and we're only going to be able to leave the house to go and buy certain supplies in certain supermarkets, you would have said to me, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're absolutely crazy. But it happened. And in some countries, it continued for way longer than it should have continued. And that's why, to me, central bank digital currencies are petrifying. And every single time that I hear talk of central bank digital currencies, instead of going home to take a Xanax, I log on to a crypto exchange and I buy myself some Bitcoin because it has the same effect. It calms me down and it says, if ever this is going to happen, then I will be okay because I have a form of money that the government can't touch and they cannot control.
But firstly, I wholeheartedly agree with how terrifying central bank digital currencies are. But Ron, if the government can sanction something like Tornado Cash, couldn't they sanction, to your point, interactions with Bitcoin?
Yeah, but that would mean that you and I could still transact with Bitcoin, but there's some corporations which wouldn't be able to transact with Bitcoin. I want to just bring up something because now we've had this whole discussion and we've spoken about the ETH proof of stake, transition to proof of stake. Now I want to throw a curveball into the mix. The two biggest validators of Ethereum are a company called LidoDAO and probably Coinbase, because Coinbase holds a lot of ETH. Now, what Coinbase is going to do is it's going to allow institutions to stake their Ethereum with Coinbase, and Coinbase is going to become a validator of transactions, right? And Coinbase will arguably be one of the biggest validators of transactions because you can assume that it's going to hold a lot of the Ethereum on the network. Now, what happens if there is a block on the Ethereum network that contains payments from Tornado Cash? And what happens if Coinbase validate the transaction? Well, theoretically, they are interacting and they are actually allowing someone who is sanctioned to put through a transaction. Now it starts to get really interesting because what happens? Do they stop the Ethereum network? Do they not mine the blocks? Do they omit certain blocks? Because if that happens, then Ethereum becomes worthless. Because if you can't have if you have censored transactions, you don't need a blockchain. The whole purpose of a blockchain is to have immutable, uncensorable transaction, peer-to-peer money transfer without a censorship body in between. And that is one of the big concerns that's happening now. Steve touched on it earlier, where certain entities are going to control a large amount of the staking power. And unfortunately, a lot of those entities are actually centralized, people like Coinbase. And this throws another thing into another spanner into the works here.
You know, you started off on such a bullish sentiment, and now you've taken us into such bearish territory when we started.
You took us to Tornado Cash. You took us to Tornado Cash.
when we start to contemplate some of these very, very, very real concerns, Steve, we're going to have to wrap this up. I'm going to give you the final word here.
Yeah, I think that by Rand describing some of the potential catastrophic effects of government sanctioning Coinbase, shutting down the Ethereum network, all of which is possible were OFAC to start throwing their weight around in completely irrational ways. I think, Rand, I disagree with you. I think that is the reason why firepower will be found to challenge the government on this. It's simply too important. So let me leave this on an up note, because I read a long legal analysis of this today by one of the parties who is raising a lawsuit against OFAC. That I believe that case will be successful. I believe there will be a chilling effect until they are able to win that, which may be months or years. But I think eventually the government will stand down. For no other reason than it's not only the reason that it's legally unenforceable to take a neutral piece of code. I mean, you can say, for instance, like we're going to sanction all cars because cars are used in getaways. It's exactly the same argument. But more importantly than that, there are going to be 1,000 mixers out there next week. They can't stop this. It's nuts. They can't stop this. One of the examples that Rand gave is that there are some guy, we don't know who it is, or person or woman somewhere has been sending all these tiny little pieces of ETH to a bunch of celebrities. I think 600 celebrities have got there making a mockery in the entire thing. Now they've got 600 people like Jimmy Fallon and Justin Sun who have now received 0.01 ETH and they are now under investigation. The whole thing is a mockery. And I have some faith that legislative justice will prevail in this matter, and they will stand up.
Steve, do you have enough faith to buy some Tornado Cash at this price?
Oh, I'm a Bitcoin and Ether man, Rand. That's it. I've never bought anything else.
But faith in the big picture, faith that sanity, legal sanity will somehow prevail. So we'll leave it on that optimistic note, at least with regards to Ethereum and Bitcoin. Steve Sidley, thank you so much for joining us on Kitco News. Ron Neuner, always a pleasure to have you. And thank you all for watching. Keep it right here on Kitco.